the focus of our work is conservation, habitat conservation beyond protected areas, and in areas that have a high priority for conservation, which are usually places where we live as humans or where we produce our food.
Okay. You highlighted Mediterranean systems. Can you talk about why these are valuable and vulnerable at the same time?
Okay. So Mediterranean ecosystems, that we have 5 in our planet,
Yes.
determined by the Mediterranean climate, are very have high biodiversity, high diversity of species, and they have a high rate of endemism, which is basically that the species that they have are unique of those places.
Okay.
The reason of that is that the Mediterranean climate is one of the few climates that have the 4 seasons well marked, and that means that during a long period there is no water, and during other periods you will have water. So that have created special adaptations of the plants that live there, for example, and therefore it's a selective force or pressure that incentivated in the time for new species.
Okay.
That's why they are very endemic and common of those specific places.
And what pressures are they under now?
The main pressures is basically human activity. So as I mentioned in the conference, if we look at the 4 Mediterranean ecosystems, only 4.2% of that surface is under any conservation, official conservation scheme.
Yeah.
And if we go and move to Chile, for example, in our Mediterranean region, less than 1% of that surface is under any conservation, which is not rare if we think that 70% of the population in Chile lives in the Mediterranean region, and most of the agriculture is done there.
Yeah, okay. In terms of Chile, in particular, you have a particular vulnerability to El Nino and things like that. What sort of pressures does that add on top of your systems? Can you talk a little bit more?
So El Nino, it's a phenomenon that we have been used to it, and it comes every 7 or 10 years. The regime has been changing a bit because of climate change, and that is under study. But I would say that the huge pressure about climate change now is beginning to be like these extreme weather events, so as many other places. So we are having extreme droughts. We have been facing a mega drought,
yes,
it's called, the last 10 years. So that is beyond El Nino or La Nina. So that is definitely one, big pattern of climate change.
Okay, and the drought, and that's driving other impacts such as
fire, for example. So it's very important to talk about fire, in fact, because if we look at the 5 Mediterranean regions, in the other 4, fire is natural, so naturally caused. Yeah. But in Chile, there is very little evidence that show that it might have been at one time, natural. That means that now, because of high temperatures and, of course, human activity, we are having lots of fires, losing lots of native forests, plantations, crops in general, and this is going to continue. And the worst thing is that our native forest is not adapted to fire. Therefore, after a big fire, as the one that we had 2 years ago, it's very difficult so that we get a regeneration of our forests.
And do you think this is part of, I know it's a sort of a warming trend, part of a warming trend, but it's also a signal of a changing planet where you didn't have that before, you have it now. If it continues, it's quite devastating.
Yeah. Well, there is a discussion if we have already got into that tipping point that it's called in science. Really, we are living in a world that we are living in a planet, in a dynamic that we have never, as humans, have lived before. And that's why science is so important. Science connected with community and real world, because every step we take needs to be evaluated like instantly, because we as humans and as a society have never been in this situation before.
No.
Never.
It's inspiring to see big brands acting on climate change, But how can this filter down to smaller producers who don't have those resources?
We have the companies that are member of our program are some of them very big, and some of them are very small. Okay, so we have the full range. However, there are, we have conservation. It's not necessarily very expensive, so it's not a huge cost.
Right.
Okay, so that is the first thing that we need to say. When you have forest, I mean, it's not the same as putting forest back. Okay, so it's not terribly expensive. However, there are some activities that small vineyards are unable to do very often, like for example biodiversity inventories in their farms, and that's why we are now applying for a governmental funding to specifically work with very small wine producers. So we hope we get that grant. So hopefully this year we will begin to work specifically with a bunch of, it's a group like of 15 small producers all over Chile.
Brilliant. And sorry, what's the name of the program that you mentioned?
Well, our program?
Yes.
Well, it's called Wine, Biodiversity, Wine and Climate Change Initiative.
Okay.
We call it in Spanish, Vino, Cambio Climático and Biodiversidad.
Very good. How do these ecosystem services become resilient to climate extremes? And you're talking about the things you can do. How does that then, just in briefly, how does that build resilience?
Well, resilience is the key for climate change. And when you keep biodiversity, so you keep high values of species diversity, for example, and you keep native ecosystems, you are building on resilience. For example, with one of the things that happen with climate change is that you begin to have more diseases, for example. So it may rain a lot, for example, near the harvest, and then you will get a lot of botrytis.
Yeah.
We have seen, for example, that when your plots are near the forest, the incidence of botrytis is lower than if your plot is very far away from the forest. And the reason why of that is something that we know in ecology, which is called disease ecology, which is that if you have more diversity of species, the disease or the species that you don't want, colonizes, has different hosts. If you have a monoculture, you will have only one host.
Okay, I understand. This is the ingredients of a great brand story for people who are taking these actions. How much impact is this research having in Chile and beyond in terms of going to the producers and then on to consumers in terms of awareness?
Well, we have been focusing these 10 years on producers,
yes,
more than in clients.
Yeah.
To be honest, at the beginning I was very afraid that this initiative would be, used like greenwashing or something like that, and so people were quite critical and saying, why the government, this is funded by the government, no? This, our National Science Council. Why would be, putting money on big companies and eventually doing greenwashing? So I was very careful on how we communicate outside this project.
Yes.
That made something very curious, which is that our companies don't use our project to market their products yet. So we haven't got to the clients too.
Okay.
But the important thing for us now, and we're going to work on it, is that now we have a very solid strategy. We have data that show that they have been working these 10 years, not only, filling their, marketing strategies. So the idea now is to move forward with them and begin to educate the consumers, and hopefully that will help them also to sell more.
I think there's an upward push from consumers asking questions
Yes.
about sustainability.
Yes, and I think sustainability in general, and I think it's very important to make this point also, that when we talk about sustainability, we're implicitly thinking on biodiversity probably. But if you check, then the certifications of sustainability and sustainability schemes in general, they are very inspecific about biodiversity. So what we want here, and that's what we have made in the Sustainability Code of Chile, is that biodiversity is explicitly named, then conservation measures are part of the scheme and they are explained why.
Yeah.
Because if you say someone, you need to have biodiversity in your farm, what's that? What kind of biodiversity? How much? How are you going to measure it? How do I help you so that you can understand how to manage your biodiversity? So that's why our program is very focused on biodiversity and ecosystem services.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.